Awesome. Good morning to everybody trickling in. We'll probably just give it about a minute before we get started. Feel free to chime in the chat where you're dialing in from, as we're just waiting for a couple more folks before we dive in with myself and Brad this morning. Awesome. Well, we do have a really exciting session today, so I'm just going to dive in. We're 1 minute past the hour. Hello and good morning to everyone. My name is Colleen. I'm the Customer and Community Marketing Manager here at DScout, and I will be your moderator for this exciting conversation. We're really going to dive in to how the team at Vivid Seats, one of DScout's customers, uses continuous discovery research to drive impactful and data-driven decisions that both enhance and improve their user experience as well as accelerate their business growth. And before we dive in, I wanted to make a couple housekeeping notes. So as you may have heard when you joined, the session is being recorded. So we will send you the recording afterwards, likely later this afternoon. So feel free to sit back and absorb the conversation. We'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A box along the bottom of your Zoom screen to send in the questions so that Brad and I can get to them at the end of the session. I'll keep an eye on them throughout, but we should have plenty of time at the end. And again, would love to know where folks are dialing in. I'm calling in from Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was blue skies yesterday, very cloudy today. But feel free to drop your location in the chat and we'll go ahead and get started. But joining us today is our lovely speaker, Brad Mattan. He's a senior UX researcher at Vivid Seats, and his work has been really instrumental in shaping user experience as well as driving key business outcomes through continuous discovery. So Brad, I wanted to give you a quick chance to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your role and Vivid Seats more broadly before we dive in.
Sure thing. Good morning and good afternoon to the folks who are joining from other parts of the world. My name is Brad Mattan. I'm a senior UX researcher at Vivid Seats. So my role at Vivid Seats is part of a small but mighty UX design and research team. My area of focus is in the web side, but we also have my partner in crime in UX, Evelyn Brito, on app, and we've got a number of other products too. Being a two-sided marketplace, we work in the B2B space as well.
Excellent. And in the time that we have today, Brad will kind of take us through this journey of continuous discovery at Vivid Seats, the cross-functional collaboration he briefly spoke to just now of working so closely on the same team as a lot of design colleagues, and ultimately how this process has driven results for Vivid Seats. So let's dive right in. Yeah, to start, I would love for us to dive into how Vivid Seats research practices have evolved over time. Brad, I'm wondering if you could kind of share an overview or a brief history of the research program at Vivid Seats over the last couple years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose I should start a little bit more saying about who we are at Vivid Seats. I think some folks who may not be familiar with us, so I do want to make sure to cover that too. So Vivid Seats is a resale ticketing marketplace. So this is where you might go if, for example, tickets to your sporting event or your concert got sold out and you're like, oh, I missed out on the pre-sale or the on-sale. I'm going to see if I can get some resale tickets. So Vivid Seats is one great place to go. We're actually the only resale marketplace that has a rewards program. So just putting in a plug for that. So yeah, lots of great things. We've got web, we've got app, you name it. As far as how research has worked at Vivid Seats in the past, I joined almost 2 years ago now. So since that time, in the beginning, we initially started off as following a bit of an agency model where different stakeholders would come to UX research. So we were a group of two or three. They'd come and be like, hey, we need to better understand what's going on here with, such and such page, or how are users approaching something like parking? Let's do a baseline study. That was a frequent request, a sort of baseline, like let's learn all that we can about this one thing. Very broad research asks. Then we would work with those stakeholders to refine their questions and help them to come to okay, what do you really want to know? and what's the best approach to getting answers to those questions so that you can make the decisions you need to make. So from the beginning, the purpose and drive of UX research at Vivid Seats has been to help stakeholders make decisions. As I kind of alluded to with requests for things like baseline studies, sometimes that is stakeholders needed some help kind of refining their questions. And so I would say about a year ago, we switched it up a little bit and we actually brought UXR into different product groups. So there are a number of reasons for doing this, and I won't get into all of them. But I will say one kind of pain point that we experienced in UX research was not always understanding or knowing what was going on as far as the decisions that needed to be made. We were sort of They came to us when they needed answers, but we didn't necessarily understand or know the full context behind why we were pursuing what we were pursuing, which does limit your ability to make good research recommendations and even just set up the study if you don't know the full context. So we ended up switching to a more embedded matrix model where each UX researcher was embedded into a specific team. So that's how I came to be more involved with the web team. That's how Evelyn came to be more involved with the app team. And so now we're attending all of these stand-up meetings and understanding like, okay, here's the day-to-day. We're better able to anticipate what questions might come up, what were some of the sticking points that were blocking decisions, and then ultimately better able to put together research that answered those questions in a timely fashion. So I will say this model probably won't work for everyone. I think it works well for us because we are a relatively small team. For bigger teams, I've heard that this may not work as well, but that's the model that we found a pretty good rhythm with.
Yeah, absolutely. So with this new shift to the, kind of embedded matrix model, you have so much more like additional context to what's going on, like with the product overall. How has this kind of like enabled, faster or more flexible research, if it has yet?
Yeah, so this is a nice segue actually into continuous discovery research because this is around the same time we ended up switching into doing more of this kind of thing. But the idea was like, hey, we've got the ability to do this. We can talk to customers on a regular basis. We know things are moving fast. Stakeholders have questions. Uh, so one thing that did come out of this is we decided, hey, let's talk to customers on a more regular cadence. One big impetus or drive here for this was that we were and towards the beginning of the year in a period of rapid development and innovation, where it was very difficult for us to do research to keep up with all the changes that were happening, right? All the development that was happening. So this is how we landed on continuous discovery research. We are not able to do the full process where we do like have a research question, do some research, inform the decision, and then make the decision. The development was happening at such a rapid clip, but we wanted to be able to keep up with it and at least understand how is this impacting our users? Is there anything we missed? Are there any bugs out there that we'd like to be able to catch? So we started to implement this program of continuous discovery research where we would talk to customers, one or two customers a week, and pay special attention to some of the releases that just happened in that week, and then monitor that over time. So we're tracking the analytics, of course, and that's a whole other side of UX research. But the qualitative piece was really important because we could understand why users were not using filters, for example. So that was a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're gonna spend plenty of time on like more details into continuous discovery in a few slides, but I did want to spend a little bit of time in the beginning, talking a little bit more about this. I don't even know if collaboration is the right word since you're on the same team as so many design colleagues now. I think so often I speak with customers who sit on a design team and work with folks in UXR, or the inverse, where they're UXR, they work closely with designers. But your team really struck me as kind of unique that it is already like mixed on the same team sitting within product, with you as the senior UXR along with designers on the same team. I would love to know a little bit more about kind of how has it worked since this team structure has changed, and how have you been able to work with your designer colleagues to kind of like take part in research as well and become like this broader extension of the research that you're doing?
Mhm. Yeah, great question. And I will say one important piece here is buy-in from leadership. So our manager of UX, Danny Zagorski, he's been really encouraging our team, designers and researchers, to really develop our skills more broadly. So we're not just doing research, just doing designs. We're really ideally expanding out that skill set. We might have one area of focus, but we want to be able to support our colleagues across the board. So with that push from management, and really we ended up getting buy-in from the whole design team. Like everybody wanted research. Evelyn and I had very limited capacity to deliver on that. But now, with this push for designers to get more involved in research, we're growing our capacity exponentially, I would say, because there's so many more designers than researchers. So it's really been great to see designers have been stepping up, learning research. Some had different levels to begin with, but I've seen steady leveling up across the board, and that's really just encouraging to see. So now, if we have a research question and our UX researchers are busy with certain areas of focus, can be like, well, hey, how about we have one of our designers lead this project? And that is what we've been doing lately. So we've really been able to grow and expand our research. And happy to talk more about the training piece there, because this is something I really love to do, is work with people to grow their skills. But it is a slow process that you do have to be intentional about and ramp it up over time.
Yeah, I would love for us to talk a little bit about like the training. I know this has been a change that's been ongoing since earlier this year of how have you been able to like support folks in design where they feel like comfortable and confident enough really to like be leading the kinds of research that maybe in a previous year would have been you or Evelyn.
Yeah, so the question is, how do we get to that point?
Yeah, how do you get to
Yeah,
that point?
yeah. So it partly depends on where the designer is as far as their research chops. For some, we had one who was ready to dive right into moderating. Others needed a bit more practice with just understanding how does research work from the ground up. So I'll speak to more the latter point, where we have a designer who's just getting into research, really eager and excited to do it, but didn't have a lot of that background. So I ended up working with this designer first on note taking. And this parallels my own training in UX research. So speaking to that from personal experience as well, uh, had her sit in on a bunch of sessions and take notes. And what I would do is afterwards go through the notes, provide line by line feedback, very specific, like, hey, it would be great to have this level of detail here. The user said that they didn't want to use this feature because of X. So really just driving home that the why is super important to note taking. Um, so then the next step after that would be to use what she's gradually leveled up and has phenomenal notes now. I'm very, very impressed. The next step then is to take those notes and now on the back end, translate them into something that we can share with stakeholders. So we'll touch more on that in a bit, I'm sure, but just mapping those notes into something that's more of a snapshot of the interview that we can share with stakeholders. Then the final step, and this is the one that's really scary for folks who haven't done it before, but that's moderating, which turns out to not be so scary in the end. But that's something, and you'll gradually coach over time. And I will say something like continuous discovery research is very useful for building up skills of researchers because it's relatively low stakes. If you have a session that doesn't go great, it's not the end of the world. It's okay. It's one session. You're not, ruining any particular project. Um, but yeah, that is how I see it from start to finish as far as building up design and their capacity to do research.
Awesome. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
And I think this like leads us to a nice transition of just like going deeper on continuous discovery at Vivid Seats of like what does it look like in practice? I know you alluded to and mentioned the live interviews with live event attendees and users, as well as I know we talked about some like prototype tests to have this kind of always on feedback loop. Can you kind of walk us through the different kinds of research that you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been definitely something that's evolved over time. So we started doing continuous discovery research around January, February of this year. We gave it some thought before that, just as far as process, but ultimately what we had on paper in January looks very different from how we're doing it now in October. So I'll speak to how we're currently doing it and maybe touch on some of the learnings from previous ways of approaching this. Um, So I'll say typically how the week works for us. I'll start the week and put out a post in our UX design research Slack channel and be like, hey, this week I'll be leading a session with a user using mobile web. Um, do we have any prototypes, any questions, any areas of focus that you want to make sure that we cover in this session? So this is part of how we're informing decisions at a more rapid cadence. Whereas before they might have had to approach UX research and ask like, hey, in a couple weeks, can we do this project? Now it can be like today or tomorrow, you're going to get your answer. It might not be a full study, but you're going to get at least one user's detailed feedback where you have the opportunity to ask them why and ask them follow-up session questions in the session. And so it really does lead to a more rapid pace. Sometimes though, designers, stakeholders, they don't have anything that they want to touch on. So we do have a discussion guide that we will follow that just covers the basics of like, tell me about the last time you were shopping for tickets. So what sort of live events do you like to go to? And then we'll of course have a usability session where they'll run through the mobile website and kind of simulate shopping for tickets. Um, so that's in general how this session works. Now, I did see a question in the chat about recruiting, and that's a really important piece. And that's actually where DScout really shines for us. We can run a screener. So my colleague Evelyn, she put together a beautiful screener for Q4 that asks a bunch of things that we care about, that we're thinking about currently in this quarter, and we got something like 170 responses to that screener. So now we've got a good set of users who are live event attendees. So this is the audience we're typically talking to. We know some of their basic behaviors about how many times a year do they go, what sort of live events do they like to attend, which is great. If we have a question about like, oh, I need to talk to a concert goer this week, or I need to talk to a sports fan, that's going to allow us to have a very like specific user that touches on the questions that interest us in that given point in time. So really, it's a matter of at the beginning of the week, once we kind of know what questions we want to ask, what areas we want to cover, we'll go into the screener, look through the screener responses, and find a user that closely matches the profile of the person that we want to talk to that week. We'll send them an invite. Scouts are super fast at responding. So they'll usually confirm within half a day or so. And really, that's all there is to it. As far as designers and those who are moderating, it's not just the UX researchers now. I'll reach out to one of our designers and be like, hey, will you be moderating an interview this week? And this really does depend on schedules, right? Sometimes the answer is no, sometimes the answer is yes. If we can get two, then we'll cover desktop and web, for example. So, it's pretty flexible process, but something that we've really gotten down to a good cadence. One piece I'll add about recruitment, when we first started out, we were recruiting from Vivid Seats customers. So there's a reason for this because we wanted to talk to customers who are experiencing the website and seeing some of the changes that were happening at that time. We did find that recruit was a little trickier than that way because they would have to go through the onboarding process, which I have seen DScouts really improved upon in the last few months. So that I don't think we would encounter the same issues that we did at first. But just know that if you are reaching out to your own customers, there's that added hurdle. So in the recruit email that we sent out to our customer database customers, we let them know like, here's the process, step 1, 2, and 3. And yeah, we look forward to talking to you. It is nice that it's flexible though, so you can compensate with a gift card if it's your own customer, or if it's a user through DScout, a scout, there's that process of reimbursing them too.
Yeah, absolutely. That is really cool that you're able to like offer folks like Vivid Seats or gift card or credit so they can kind of continue to use your product. And so I know you kind of touched on how DScout fits into the workflow when it comes to recruiting. Is there anything you can share around how you're using DScout or how your like design colleagues are finding like live interviews through DScout?
Yeah, great piece. And that's something that I didn't touch on as far as the process, but we have a core group of people, stakeholders who come to these calls. So when a user does, or when a scout does confirm their session, I'll create a calendar invite event that includes the link to the session. It goes out to stakeholders, typically in design, product management, and marketing. These are kind of the main folks who will join our calls and listen in. And we've gotten to a point where routinely we've got anywhere between 5 to 8 people on these calls, and it's just really great to see that level of engagement. The chat is super active, not so different from the current chat. So as a moderator, it can be a bit of a challenge. You'll go through and check out the comments, make sure you're asking the questions that stakeholders care about. but it's been really great overall. As far as like what do we do afterwards, we do end up writing up a snapshot of the session, which we'll touch on in a bit. Um, so even if you can't join the call, you can still see the summary of the interview in our Slack channel, our UX research Slack channel, which has stakeholders, not just from design, marketing, product, but also from beyond. So customer service, we even have some C-suite folks in there. So it really does give a broad coverage and impact.
Awesome. I think this leads us in actually perfectly for you to kind of walk through, um, you know, the readout in the form of the interview snapshot. I know we also got a question in the chat from Lori around capturing output and if you're finding decks for each participant. But I know you use interview snapshot instead.
Yes. So just a little bit of background on this. This is kind of lifted from continuous discovery habits from Teresa Torres. So I would be remiss not to mention that she's been a huge influence on how we've been approaching this. In fact, this all started with a book club that one of our product managers started out where we read that book. And then I spent some time in December, January thinking through like, okay, how would this work at Vivid Seats? What would our snapshot look like? So some things are similar to what you would see in Teresa Torres's snapshot, but we have made some modifications that may or may not work outside of Vivid Seats. But here's how we do it. So we've got a bit of a quote at the top, something that came from a very memorable moment. So this user was talking about how they couldn't see the price breakdown because it was hidden behind some other UI element. We'll include a link to the session so that if, as a stakeholder, you want to go back and watch a key moment, you can do that. And then basically the meat and potatoes of this is what worked for the user and what didn't work. Stakeholders don't have a whole lot of time to read through everything that happened. So really a bulleted list about what's going well, what's not going so well. What's going well is important because as we're releasing a bunch of stuff, it's really helpful to know like, hey, we released this, a user found it helpful. It's just encouraging, especially if you're a developer who might spend a lot of time in the code, but not necessarily seeing the fruits of your labor. So just being able to see that, it's really encouraging and good for morale. As far as what didn't work, of course, we care about that because we want to be able to continuously improve. So we've got bullets on different parts of the funnel and what worked or didn't work there. At the bottom, you'll see this final row where it says special focus area. That depends. So that would be an area, for example, where we would share observations. For example, if we shared a prototype that day, or if we had a specific question, let's say about music festival pages, we might dedicate a special section just to that. So that section may or may not exist. But yeah, this is what ultimately I'll take a picture of this and share it in Slack, providing a link to the document where this information lives. And I do say document. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, I just think it's a lot easier to create a Word document, put the information in and be done with it. Whereas slides, you have to mess around with formatting a lot. So just culturally at Vivid Seats, we do lean more towards documents as opposed to slide decks. And that's the reason for that. Another benefit though, and I think this might actually work for slides too, is that we have Copilot. So we can do AI-based analysis, right? So we can ask AI, go through this directory, tell me what worked and what didn't work in this quarter. And so you can get a nice quick summary across a longer period of time of what was going well and what wasn't going well. And I did pilot that and try it out. We're still trying to refine that piece, so I can't speak too much to it, but there's a lot of potential to synthesize across format share outs when you have this kind of way of structuring them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, do you also share a link to the interview recording for either like stakeholders who couldn't make it or like that broader group of folks who you share the snapshot with, or do you keep that like more limited?
Yeah, great question. So yes to all of the above. So we'll include in this snapshot both a link to the full session if you want to go back and watch it. But you may notice throughout, sprinkled in these different cells are, where it says video link, for example. That's where we might actually share a link to a clip just for that specific moment. Sometimes the summary does justice to what happened, but really, like other times, it's very useful to share with stakeholders. Like, please look at this video. This really encapsulates what happened with this user and why it was such a pain point. And sometimes, because we are posting this in Slack, we might even tag, if somebody from customer service wasn't there, but we think that this is really relevant to them, we might tag them in a thread and be like, hey, check out this link. This is what happened with this user. Uh, so it's a great way to socialize findings and get people to kind of take a closer look. And this has led to tickets and refinements to our web and app experiences as a result.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like I've definitely heard so many of our customers echo that point around like, it is great to share quotes, but like it's even better when you're able to just like quickly send people to like the actual snippet and they can hear it like from the customer's mouth themselves. So they always like love to make video clips using Dscout and send people right there so they can just watch, take it in, and then obviously also go through the summary. With that, I also would love for you to kind of chat through this kind of like experience map.
Yeah, experience map. This is another piece of the snapshot. So it's for us typically a two-page document. What you saw on the first slide was the first page, and this will be a brief second page. Initially, we started off using the experience map inspired by continuous discovery habits and how that was laid out there. It's relatively easy to do. You just open up a Figma, create a flow. So we were doing this for a little while. We did find, though, that it took more time than simply just typing it out. And also, it may be difficult for the AI to process it, for example, because you do it in Figma, take a screenshot, suddenly that information is no longer accessible to AI. So we ended up opting for more of a paragraph-paced approach, which is what you see above, where it says, somewhere-based student who likes to attend sporting events. But this is kind of nice as like the flow is a nice way of sharing with stakeholders what exactly happened, what is this user's process? Because one thing we learned from continuous discovery habits is every single user has their own process for shopping for tickets, and it's just endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit of an aside, but I think I was on like Twitter or something the other day, and it was talking about how certain generations have like the big screen purchases of like if you're going to buy a plane ticket or a concert ticket, it's on desktop for some people, and then for so many others, it's like obviously I would use my phone, I would use the app. So very cool to see how everyone gets to Vivid Seats. And then, yeah, shifting a little bit into, I think now that you kind of walked through that interview snapshot and how you share this, how you get like all these insights out to the broader team, would love to learn a little more about, the insights as well as like results of where this has impacted your team as well as like the broader org.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of my favorite slides of the deck because it's really where we get to talk about how continuous discovery research has made an impact for us. And I think a lot of people, when they talk about continuous discovery research, they're like, oh, what good can one interview a week really do? Like, it doesn't sound like much. It's not a huge project with, multi pages that really drives people, or that makes people think, oh, wow, look at all the work they put in. But this is just as important, if not more, I would say, than that sort of research because it allows you to make decisions quickly. So I'll touch on I'll give you a few examples of how we've done that. So one, and I think I touched on this earlier actually, it's just it allows you to get rapid feedback on early prototypes. So designers in the past might have put a lot of thought into a prototype so that they could ready it for research and spend a week collecting data, getting analysis done, and sharing it out. Now they can rapidly create a prototype, share it with a customer, get some feedback, and then continue iterating on it. Maybe they'll ask about it again in the following week, or maybe once they're more comfortable after getting one user's feedback, like, okay, let's do a dedicated study on this. We have that kind of flexibility now, which is great, just to have that other tool in the tool belt.
Yeah.
Another thing I mentioned earlier too is just celebrating wins on Slack. If you're a developer, again, you spend a lot of time in the code, you might not get to see right away what happens when you push that release live. It takes some time. Of course, again, as I mentioned, we do pay attention to the analytics and look at how the data is moving. But sometimes it's just nice. Like, so for example, we've got, if you go on our website or on our app, you'll see deal scores. We recently made some improvements in this area. And lo and behold, we had one user the first time see this deal score and just like, oh, wow, I'm going to go with this one. This is really helpful. It helps me to know which ticket to go with. So just being able to capture those wins, to capture those moments of user delight and share it with all the stakeholders involved in bringing that to the customer, I think it's been really rewarding and encouraging for everyone. Another piece here is that it's building cross-functional empathy with users. So we have people from areas like marketing, for example, that don't typically get to see how the customers interact with, the website and talk about like what are their responses to emails, to pop-ups that appear on the website. So now suddenly they're getting to see how users in real time get to respond to like a Braze modal and get some feedback there. They're doing a lot of experimentation, but now they have this additional qualitative piece. And I want to add, I have specifically here an example of accessibility. This was a really great session we had on DScout where it was a user who was visually impaired. She was not able to see the screen. She was using a screen reader, and she shared with us a lot of valuable insights. One of them being that she typically avoids websites and will go on app because those typically are a bit more accessibility friendly, but even then, not great. So then went on to share with us like, well, usually if the app doesn't work, I don't waste my time with it. I'm just going to call customer service and see if they can help me get a ticket that's accessible. So we got to talk a little bit too about customer service. And this led to us capturing a bunch of clips, sharing that out with our friends in customer service. And it spawned a lot of discussions about like, okay, how can we be more accessibility friendly? Like, what can we do to improve? What are some of these quick wins that we can get out there? And that one session, it wasn't a very long session because she did have trouble getting connected. But those 20 minutes that we spoke with her were super, super valuable. So I just can't stress enough the cross-functional empathy that we're building and the surprises that we end up running into. We may not have run into that if all we did was a couple studies a month. By continuously talking to our customers, we really get to have those moments where we see the world through the perspective of others. Another piece, we did talk about this already, but it's just building the capacity of our full stack design team. Continuous discovery research is a great training ground, low stakes, allows them to build up those moderating and note-taking skills so that they can run not just continuous discovery research, but dedicated studies of their own, which has already happened. It's been really great for us. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit more specifically about our web and app team. And I want to acknowledge the folks who have been involved in this because this is not just me. This is a broader team in UX and design. And I want to recognize Danny Lopez and Jihei Han, who really helped and stepped up with continuous discovery research, whether that's note taking, moderating, or both. So yeah, just taking a moment to recognize them because they've been doing a great job. So some of the impacts we've seen on the web team, we have sessions where, 20 minutes later, we've got a ticket generated to address a bug that we encountered in the session. These are things that happen outside of continuous discovery research, but having that research, these dedicated 30 to 40-minute sessions with users, we find so much more this way. And because we have product managers on the call, because we have design folks on the call, they're picking up on these things and making notes and sometimes submitting the tickets themselves. So it's been really great in that regard. A couple examples of this, we had a pop-up that's just logic and timing was just a little bit off, and we kept seeing this across multiple sessions, actually. So it led to multiple tickets where we continuously refined. Our calendar view, which we have for some performers like Major League Baseball, for example, we noticed there was a bug there that we were able to get corrected pretty quickly and made that even more useful for our customers. And another piece here that's been really helpful for the web team is it's prompted deeper inquiry. So if we run into a pain point, they're like, I never really thought about that before. A good example of this is over filtering. So we had a user who was on a page looking for listings. She ended up filtering in a number of different ways that led to no listings. And she thought like, I guess this event is sold out. So it got us thinking like, how often does this happen? That's ultimately a question of numbers that we had to dig into our analytics. We realized that, we need to actually work into our code how we track this. So it's led to improvements, not just in identifying bugs and addressing them, but also improving our analytics and our ability to track user pain points. So that's been a really helpful piece there. Moving on to the app team, and that's led by my partner in UX, Evelyn Brito. She's been doing a phenomenal job leading up that team and working with Leo, one of our designers, on running these sessions. So a couple things I've learned from talking with the app team is that continuous discovery gives them greater confidence in the ability to prioritize development queues. They might see in real time, like, oh, this user's they're really struggling with this piece. Why isn't it higher up in our development queue? So we're able to shift things around accordingly based on that. And it's also led to design updates, things we weren't necessarily thinking about updating, but as a result of a session, we decided, hey, we can make this better. So one example here was a price slider where they were finding that the user was trying to engage with the price slider to set a filter, and the minimum just wasn't setting how they wanted it to. And they said, I just wish I could type in numbers. So that's what we did. We made it possible for them to manually enter the numbers if that's easier for them. So those are just some examples of the impact that continuous discovery research has had. You know, we may have found some of these answers doing dedicated projects, for example, on a production page or on checkout. But when you go through these experiences every single week, you don't necessarily have to do those projects. So yeah, there's just some impacts here, but stuff that we're really proud of as a team and excited to share with you all.
Yeah, no, that's so awesome that you're able to point to like, specific features or things that are really important, like accessibility, where,
Mm.
it may not have come up for like a certain amount of time if this had not been brought up by a user in an interview. So this is really cool. Um, I know we are getting close towards the end, but I would love how briefly we could talk about some of like the making data-driven decisions. I know you just alluded to some of these interviews leading you to dive into data and then also a real need for like improved analytics for the company. I am curious about how this has possibly encouraged like a culture of iteration at Vivid Seats.
Yeah, absolutely. I see in your first bullet point, actually, you've got A/B testing, which is a great example of how. So we've made some changes to how users can filter for different listings. And we had some questions around like, well, what's the optimal configuration for this page? Like what's going to increase filter use? What's going to help people find the tickets they need and ultimately get to checkout? So we keep finding from some of these continuous discovery interviews that customers are missing some of the filters. And so we start to think like, okay, let's see if we can do an experiment here and really move things around and see what works best for customers. So that has led to iteration in experimentation, which has just been really great. The flip side of this too is we'll run experiments and surprise, surprise, one of our users ends up in one of the conditions during continuous discovery. So while we're collecting the quantitative piece and understanding causality, we can also get a bit of the why, which that's been really helpful to have that whole big picture. So it's very much compatible with quantitative approaches like experimentation and A/B testing. Faster decision making, I think I covered a bit already just from some of those examples I shared on the previous slide. And then this last piece, prototypes, I think I saw a question in the chat about this too. It's a really important one because we've used other services in the past before Dscout. Hard to imagine those times at this point, but where prototype testing was very difficult. In Dscout, it's super easy. You just send them a link. There are some things you can do to make prototypes easier to present, splitting them out from the rest of the design file, making sure that it's publicly accessible. These are all important. But really, like we can test just about any prototype, whether it's mobile web, desktop. We use Figma for our prototypes for what that's worth, but I think you also have other options for testing. And yeah, just as an example, this week I will be testing on Thursday a prototype for different animations on one of our pages, trying to get some feedback for one of our graphic designers to help iterate there. So it's really leading to faster iteration in design because we can get these prototypes in front of users quickly. It doesn't just have to be the live experience. It can be a prototype, and in fact, it can be very valuable to show them prototypes.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think to wrap up, I would love to get your thoughts and hear from you on some best practices, particularly like for any teams looking to build out or improve upon their continuous discovery research model. Kind of like, are there any practical steps or quick wins for teams that are like just starting out and beginning to think about this in the way that you were around this time last year?
Yeah, great question. I definitely want to repeat something I said earlier, just about really taking the time to be intentional and think through how do you want to approach this. Um, One piece is you got to make sure that you have buy-in from your leadership, from your manager. whoever is in charge of UX and research, because without that, it can be very hard to get designers on board or to get, PMs on board. If you have everyone saying like, hey, this is a valuable thing, let's do it, great. Um, so maybe if you're in very early stages, perhaps organizing a book club around continuous discovery habits. For us, that was the catalyst, the spark that really got us going. So just kind of think about where you are and how you want to get there. So after we read that book, as I mentioned, I did put together a draft of like, okay, here's how we're going to approach recruitment. Here's how we're going to share out the findings. Here's where we're going to share out the findings and who we want to have involved in these sessions. Um, and reaching out to people too, and talking to them. Like we reached out to product managers and say, hey, we're going to start doing this. It'd be great to have you on the calls. You can join late if you need to. That's okay. But just having people listening in, even if they're multitasking, is better than nothing at all. So those are some tips. If there are any more specific questions around getting started, I'm happy to answer those. But I realize the context at every company is so different.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we'll have a little bit of time in Q&A too. So if anyone has any more specific questions, feel free to send them over to the Q&A box where we'll hop into on the next slide. And then I think just to wrap up on this one with best practices is, you know, it sounds like you've had a really great experience becoming this like cross-functional powerhouse with product and design. I know other folks may not yet have had that experience. I'm curious if you have any like tips or recommendations for folks who maybe sit in like more siloed teams but want to work more closely with product and design.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because so much of this does depend on the structure. I will say, for what it's worth, having a continuous discovery program is not really dependent, I don't think, on structure all that much. You can, even if you are in a more siloed position, you can still start running these sessions and just getting feedback. And that could be a good way actually to get more exposure into an understanding of what's going on in the world of product and design if you're a little bit siloed or removed from that. Because if you have these stakeholders in your sessions, they can start asking questions. You might have some findings that you share out afterwards that you can bounce off of them. So you can put together let me step back a little bit. So if you're not fully confident in the context, right, of what's going on in product or what's going on with design, before you post and share it more publicly, you can share it with some of those direct stakeholders and say like, hey, I saw this pain point. Here's kind of my thoughts on the opportunities here. What do you think about this? Just to get them more and more involved and get some feedback in case you are off the mark on something and missing some context. That's really important. Another piece that I don't think I've touched on yet, but when sharing some of these findings, the snapshot is not necessarily here's what we need to do right now to fix these problems. Ultimately, product managers are going to be the ones to make those calls most of the time, or designers who are iterating on their designs. So rather than providing recommendations, what we've moved to do is something more of identifying opportunities. Sometimes you can be bold in your opportunities and say like, hey, maybe we should consider this. But other times it might be more like, how might we help users do X? Here's the pain point they encountered without being prescriptive about what we should do. Like, let's get stakeholders thinking about this. And then you can tag those stakeholders in the thread and get the discussion going. So we've had some great discussions in the thread when we post these shareouts, but it's good to like just keep your stakeholders involved, get their feedback, and really encourage that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of like using it as a jumping off point to kick off a conversation versus like a we should do and then have the answer for them already. Nice, absolutely. I know we do actually already have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to shift us over to Q&A. Just a reminder, you can drop things in the Q&A box. I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat. I know there's kind of both places to put them. But to get started, someone had asked, how do you decide what research makes sense more for like a continuous discovery approach versus like a focused study that requires more data and more sessions?
Hmm. Yeah, good question. My personal opinion on this would be if it's early stage and we're not yet sure what we want to do as far as design, or we don't quite know what our customers are thinking, a first step might be continuous discovery research. You get an initial taste, you start thinking about things maybe you haven't thought about before. And then you can move on to a more dedicated study if you feel that's necessary to have the competence to make the decision you need to make. It all comes down to what's the decision you need to make. If you feel like, okay, if I can get some quick feedback and I'm comfortable with that feedback, I feel like that feedback is representative, maybe you don't need to run a full study. But if you get some initial feedback on a couple sessions and it's all over the place, like, okay, I need to have a dedicated study to really understand what's going on here. Maybe we've got different kinds of users, different kinds of use cases. Um, so it comes down to like, what's the question you need to answer and how much confidence you need with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Kamiko in the chat had asked, do you see a role for continuous discovery in an org that sees similar issues over and over, but most of the like engineering resource is allocated for new initiatives versus like iteration on existing?
Mm.
They noted that they tried continuous discovery in the past, but had seen that interest would kind of wane when you'd get the same results, hearing the same thing from users, and nothing really changing.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And without the full context on the business in case there, it's hard for me to give good advice, I feel. One way to make it more relevant and keep engagement going is like what we do every week, where we'll talk to stakeholders and ask, like, hey, what are some questions you have on your mind? You know, I could say if we were to follow just our base discussion guide every week, I think we would run into that same problem. We keep finding the same chronic user issues that come up. Even when we don't focus on special topics, they always come up. So you're always going to have those. But try to really focus on your stakeholders, whether those are designers, product managers, in customer service, marketing. What questions do they have? Because there's always questions, right? And if we can help them answer those questions, we can make our research more relevant and timely for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Next question would be if you have any direction for incorporating UXR into enterprise design teams, but where the primary, like both users and stakeholders are internal
Hmm.
versus like external customers.
Yeah, that's a
Like we're
that's what I don't have a whole lot of experience on. I'll be super honest with you there. Like enterprise is not an area that I've done a lot of work in. So if I have a second to think about that, yeah. Um,
we can always we'll come back to that one.
we may want to come back to that one. I want to say it's not so different, but I could be wrong there. So I want to be careful what I say around that.
Um, a practical question about how you use Dscout. How often are you refreshing um, the scouts you've recruited of users on Dscout?
Yeah, great question. We are currently doing this on a quarterly basis. So we have a screener that we run every quarter. I think that strikes a good balance because typically our plans are we have a list of priorities for the quarter. So that gives us a sense of what we need to learn and what we're going to be thinking about that quarter and allows us to update our screeners accordingly. I would definitely encourage a regular updating cadence for your screeners because questions do change over time. Already since we've launched our screener for this quarter, I've thought of other questions like, oh, we should have asked this. All right, that's going to go into Q1. So definitely keep a regular cadence there.
Absolutely. And then I think our last question will be the always beloved ROI question from the chat around um, how do you think about and capture return on investment for qualitative research and kind of communicate the value of that to your stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know a lot of people struggle here with more skeptical stakeholders. I will say that we're very fortunate at Vivid Seats to have generally high buy-in when it comes to the value of qualitative research. We have people, decision makers on a regular basis making decisions based on qualitative sessions. Always an asterisk, right? Because qualitative is just one point of view. But if we can match up what we see in these qualitative sessions with user data, so we have other services where we can look into website analytics and we see like, oh, so and so struggled in this session with whatever the price filter, let's say, and we can see that since this point in time, we've seen a decrease in price filter usage pairing the qualitative with the quantitative is always going to be more compelling to stakeholders. Maybe most of the time is going to be more compelling to stakeholders, I should say. But for whatever reason, we do seem to see that, quantitative takes priority. So if you can find a way to pair that, that's great. Another approach, which we haven't done yet, but as I was thinking through this webinar, something that we can and probably should do at Vivid Seats is keep track when we have a ticket that came out of a continuous discovery research session, whether that came from there, so that at the end of a quarter, we can sum up all of the bugs, all of the tickets that came out of these sessions and really make a clear case for the impact of qualitative research.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like just thinking back onto, a few slides ago where you're able to point to some specific features or some like specific feature updates that came from CDR. I feel like that's always something really great when you're able to point to like, well, see, like this is what something a customer wanted and they're using it now and they're loving it and it came from this. Awesome. Well, with that, I do want to say thank you to everyone for joining, and a special thank you to you, Brad, for sharing your insights and your experience with us today. For everyone who dialed in, I know I put this in the chat, but I will be sending out the recording probably in just a few hours, so keep your eye on your inbox. And if you are interested in continuing the conversation in our People Nerds community, I will drop a link to our Slack channel. Or, of course, follow along in our People Nerds blog, where we are frequently posting about topics like this. So I will just share the link to People Nerds here, but you'll also get it in the follow-up email if you're interested in joining our community. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone. I hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday. All right, well, take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.